There is something terrifying about a person who finally stops explaining themselves. An empath doesn't explode. They don't scream or beg. They just withdraw, silently, calmly, unapologetic ally. And for the narcissist, that silence is not just unsettling. It's dangerous. Because when the empath finally reaches their limit, after bending, shrinking, sacrificing, and giving chances nobody else would, they don't become louder, they become clearer. Their eyes no longer plead for connection. Their voice no longer trembles, trying to keep peace. They stop dancing around someone else's moods, and instead, they begin to reclaim their power. This is the moment the narcissist fears most. Not the fights, not the confrontations, but that cold, unwavering clarity of the empath who has had enough. At first, the empath tries to understand. They believe that love can heal, that kindness can reach even the most wounded hearts. They excuse red flags as trauma. They see manipulation as insecurity. They tell themselves, if I just love them harder, maybe they'll stop hurting me. But over time, their soul begins to wither, because empathy without boundaries isn't strength, it's self-betrayal. And little by little, the empath begins to realize, the more they give, the less they receive. The more they forgive, the more they're disrespected. The more they try to explain, the more their words are twisted. It's a slow awakening, but once it starts, it cannot be undone. Here's what the narcissist doesn't expect. The empath doesn't just leave, they evolve. And that evolution is not loud or dramatic. It's subtle. It's silent. It's devastatingly powerful. They stop over-explaining. They stop absorbing blame that was never theirs. They stop needing to be understood and start choosing to understand themselves. And this terrifies the narcissist, because the entire dynamic depended on the empath doubting their own reality. It required them to feel guilty for being hurt, to question their perceptions, to seek validation from the very person who was gaslighting them. But once the empath steps out of that fog, the illusion collapses. The narcissist built their control on the fragile hope that the empath would never wake up, that they would keep explaining, keep giving, keep tolerating. Because once the empath stops needing approval, once they stop being emotionally reactive, once they stop explaining why something hurt them, the narcissist loses their grip. What used to work, blame, guilt, charm, stonewalling, stops working. The empath becomes immune, and not in a bitter, vengeful way, but in a deeply calm, centered way that says, you no longer get to occupy space in me. And that's when the narcissist panics. They realize that the power was never really theirs. It was borrowed from the empath's kindness, patience, and love. But now, the empath has stopped lending it. They're no longer emotionally invested. They're no longer trying to fix what was never their responsibility. They're no longer trying to rescue someone who doesn't want to be saved. Instead, they're rebuilding themselves, not as a response to pain, but as a return to wholeness. This shift doesn't happen overnight. The empath goes through waves of grief, guilt, anger, and confusion, because it's not easy to admit that the person you loved was never really showing up with love in return. It's not easy to realize you were emotionally manipulated, not just once, but repeatedly. It's not easy to forgive yourself for knowing deep down and still staying. But this is also where the true transformation begins, because the empath doesn't become heartless. They become aware of their patterns, aware of their wounds, aware of what love should feel like and what it definitely should not. And in this awareness, they start reclaiming the most sacred thing they had forgotten, their own worth. Not the worth based on how needed they are, not the worth based on how much pain they can hold, not the worth based on how forgiving they can be, but the worth that says, I do not need to earn love by sacrificing myself. This realization is liberation, and it marks the end of the narcissist's reign, because now, the empath is no longer operating from a place of fear or need. They are grounded, they are whole, and they are no longer available for emotional warfare. The narcissist will try to reel them back, and they will say things like, I miss the old you, you've changed, why are you so cold now, you're not being fair. But none of it lands, because the empath finally sees through the noise. They've been gaslit long enough to know the difference between guilt and responsibility, love and control, empathy and self-erasure. They are done being the emotional sponge for someone else's projections. They are done twisting themselves to keep peace. That was never real. They are done sacrificing their needs in the name of being kind, and what happens next is not revenge. It's not a war. It's not a performance. It's just a quiet, sacred exit. One that says, I choose me now. And that sentence, that choice, is the most terrifying thing a narcissist can witness. Because the empath, they underestimated, the one they thought they could always manipulate, guilt, or discard, has become the one person they can no longer touch. Not because the empath fought harder, but because they finally stopped fighting for what was already dead. You're not broken for being sensitive. You're not weak for feeling deeply. And you're definitely not wrong for finally choosing yourself. Before we continue, know this. If you're ready to reconnect with your inner strength, and finally understand why you keep attracting the same painful patterns, there's a powerful method based on CARL Jung's teachings. It's called the JUNG METHOD, and it can change how you see yourself forever. The link is pinned in the first comment. The empath who snaps isn't angry. She's not explosive. She doesn't become a mirror of the narcissist's chaos. No. She becomes still, almost eerily still, because it's in that stillness that her clarity blooms. And with that clarity, she no longer fights to prove her worth. She simply leaves the battlefield, not always physically at first, but emotionally, spiritually, energetically, and the narcissist can feel it, like a rope suddenly going slack in their hand, like pulling the strings of a puppet and realizing the puppet's not attached anymore. They might laugh at first, mock her, pretend they don't care. They might double down on their tactics, using guilt, nostalgia, even sudden sweetness, but behind that mask is panic, because the empath's silence is not empty. It's full of decision, of reckoning, of quiet, grounded power. It's the silence that comes after a storm, not before it. It's not a threat, it's a verdict. Let's talk about what really happens after the empath detaches. She reclaims her time that used to be spent analyzing messages, second-guessing emotions, walking on eggshells. Now that energy is poured back into her creativity, her rest, her passions. The narcissist no longer occupies her hours or her mind. She reclaims her body. She notices the tension she used to carry in her shoulders, her jaw, her gut. She realizes how many times her body screamed no while her mouth said yes. Now, she starts to listen. She lets her body exhale. She reclaims her voice, not for them, not to argue or defend, but for herself. She speaks her truth, not to convince, but to express. And that expression becomes sacred. The narcissist tries to provoke. They send cryptic messages. They post things designed to trigger jealousy or regret. They use mutual friends as messengers. They may even pretend they've changed, but it no longer matters, because the empath has changed, and that's the only change that counts. She doesn't need revenge. She doesn't crave closure from someone who is never honest. She understands now. Closure isn't something they give you. It's something you give yourself. And when she gives it, it's final. The narcissist, at their core, needs supply. They feed off attention, good or bad. They thrive on being central in someone else's emotional world. But the empath who snaps becomes unavailable, not as punishment, but as healing. Her presence becomes a gift, no longer something to be stolen, drained, or exploited. And this is what the narcissist cannot stand, that the empath is no longer accessible, not emotionally, not energetically, not spiritually. She has stepped into a place they cannot reach, because it's a place built on self-love. Let's go deeper into why this shift is so feared. The empath in the beginning reflects the narcissist's fantasy, always understanding, always forgiving, always available. But when she awakens, she becomes their mirror, not of idealization, but of truth. She reflects their lies, their manipulations, their emptiness, and the narcissist can't tolerate being seen in this way. Because the empath no longer feeds their delusion, she exposes it not through confrontation, but by simply no longer participating in it. And that is the purest form of power. She doesn't post for attention. She doesn't seek sympathy. She doesn't try to win. She simply moves on. And that is unbearable for the narcissist, because they no longer matter. They no longer define her. She has remembered who she was before the pain, and even more importantly, she's becoming who she was always meant to be because of it. Let's not romanticize this process. It's not easy. The empath grieves, not just the person, but the illusion. She mourns the fantasy she tried to build on top of someone else's brokenness. She cries over the time lost, the energy wasted, the self-abandoned dot, but slowly, gently, she forgives herself, not because it was okay, but because it's over, and from that forgiveness, a new version of her is born, one that is softer and stronger, wiser and freer, more discerning, more radiant. Here's the deeper truth. The narcissist didn't break her. They revealed her fractures, and in doing so, they gave her the chance to finally heal them. She no longer sees herself as the victim. She sees herself as the survivor, as the rebuilder, as the woman who walked through fire and didn't come out ashes, but light. She learned the difference between love and dependency, attention and affection, possession and partnership, and she'll never forget it. From now on, she protects her peace, not with walls, but with wisdom. She's not guarded. She's aware. She sees the signs early. She trusts her instincts. She no longer explains her boundaries. She simply enforces them. She becomes dangerous to any system built on manipulation, not because she attacks, but because she can no longer be seduced by pain. Dressed up as passion, she has rewritten the story, and in that story, she is not the healer of broken men. She is the keeper of her own soul. The narcissist fades, slowly, desperately, trying to trigger, to haunt, to echo, but she's no longer listening. She's tuned to a different frequency now, one that only responds to love, truth, respect. She no longer craves what hurt her. She no longer needs to be chosen by someone who never really saw her, because she has chosen herself. And that's the end of the cycle. Not with a bang, but with a quiet rising. The empath who snaps doesn't become cruel, she becomes whole. And in that wholeness, she becomes invisible to the narcissist's tactics and radiant to anyone aligned with real love. Not everyone will understand her evolution, but those who've walked through darkness and reclaimed their light, they will know. They will recognize the power in her silence, the freedom in her boundaries, the beauty in her return to herself. Because when the empath snaps, the narcissist panics, but she doesn't. She breathes, she stands tall, she walks away, and this time, she doesn't look back.